I'm a head. I'm a man. I'm the first mammal to wear pants.
You are Locked On Fantasy Basketball, your daily podcast on fantasy basketball. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day.
Hello and welcome to the Locked On Fantasy Basketball podcast brought to you by FanTrax and Basketball Monster. My name is Josh Lloyd and you can find me on Twitter and on Instagram at redrock_bball and facebook.com/redrockbasketball. Of course, check us out at basketballmonster.com as well, and the Twitter account over there is at baskmonster. We're going to be, we're not going to be reviewing anything today. We're going to be just a short podcast, really short and sweet. As we get to all of the action for Sunday, there are two games on Sunday. There is Game 7 of the Clippers and Jazz series in the first round, and then the first of the round 2 games, which is the Washington Wizards and the Boston Celtics. What we're going to do through the week, it looks like we're going to have 2 games every day throughout the week, so there'll be podcasts on each of those days. And when we've got a day where there's no games on or one game on, what I might do at that point is and we're planning on doing this at some point, is a 2006 draft redraft, which enables us to draft the players in the order which we think they should go as of now, but also a bit of a discussion on their value moving forward for next season and Dynasty League value. I'll be joined by someone in the Basketball Monster crew. I'm not sure exactly whether it'll be Kyle or Greg or Matt, but we will work that out. But it doesn't look like it'll be this week because, again, it appears we're going to have 2 games every day for the duration of this week. So we'll just do our standard podcast throughout the week. Then, let's get stuck straight into it.
Let's get to it.
Thank you, Mr. Bolton. We'll start things off, of course, with the first game, and these are both, if you are living down here in Australia, these are both extraordinarily early games. The first one of these games is the Washington Wizards taking on the Boston Celtics. That's a 1 p.m. Eastern game, which equates to 3 a.m. here, so good luck with that one. The second game is the Jazz and the Clippers, which is a 3:30 p.m. Eastern, 12:30 Pacific, and that is 5:30 a.m. here. So if you're playing DFS in Australia, you're going to want to be up pretty early to make sure you get all the news to set your lineups. Not that there's much that we really need to know about, because any of the question marks we had over players have sort of been sorted out already. So you can set your lineups in advance unless something weird happens, someone trips down the stairs, which we hope, of course, doesn't happen. Let's talk about this first game. It is the first game of round 2 in the NBA playoffs, the Washington Wizards and the Boston Celtics. I'll give my tip for this one. I think it's Wizards in 7. We'll see how it goes. Obviously, I think Washington looked more, not dominant, that's not the right word, more accomplished in the first round. But I guess some of that is swayed by the fact that Boston was absolutely horrendous for 2 games, and a lot of that can be attributed to the Isaiah Thomas situation with his sister, I think. So maybe I'm underestimating Boston in that sense, but I did like what Washington was able to do. Washington played Boston really well throughout the regular season as well. John Wall, Isaiah Thomas is going to be a good matchup. So I do think that Washington does get over the line here in 7, but I think this is going to be a pretty well contested series and a 7-gamer, whichever way that it does go. So that is one of the series. I gave my other tips on the other 2 series yesterday, or not yesterday, 2 days ago, when we talked about Spurs and Rockets and Cavs and Raptors. All right, so let's get into this one and start talking about where we see some value coming up. Now, with a couple of these situations, we don't know exactly what the coaches are going to do. We saw some unorthodox lineups from Boston, much like we saw a change in things for Toronto. But we don't know how much of that was matchup specific and how much of it's going to carry on. So will Gerald Green continue to start against Washington? I guess that's the big question. Now, Washington does go small at times, and Markieff Morris is not a big power forward. They'll run Markieff at the 5 as well, especially with Jan Mahinmi out, and you'll get some Oubre and Bogdanovic playing at the 4. So that actually plays into Gerald Green getting that start in Boston. But we don't know. Does Amir Johnson return back into the rotation? Do they go with more Tyler Zeller? Does Jonas Jerebko become the playoff specialist as he was pretty much last season, and he has been these last couple of games? So there is a little bit of question mark, but it does give you some GPP upside for some of those guys, but we don't know exactly what Brad Stevens is going to do. I wouldn't be shocked if Gerald Green doesn't start in this series. At this point, I'd say it's a 75% chance that he does, and that's the assumption that I'm going off. But I wouldn't be shocked if they make that change. Same as if I wouldn't be shocked if Toronto doesn't start Norm Powell in their series against the Cavs. But we'll talk about that on tomorrow's show. Let's get into the point guard matchup here. We'll start with Isaiah Thomas. He is a $9,000 player over on FanDuel, and he is $8,600 on DraftKings. Needless to say, I do like it more on DraftKings at $8,600. In the regular season, in the last 3 times that he played against Washington, he averaged 48 points on DraftKings scoring, Isaiah Thomas, and at $8,600, I'm pretty happy with that as a salary. Now, John Wall playoff defense can be a little bit different, but we saw Dennis Schroeder put up massive lines for Atlanta. So, Wall has got a great defensive reputation, and he is a very good defender, but it doesn't mean that his opponent is automatically shut out of DFS scoring. Thomas was able to do it in the regular season. Schroeder was able to do it in the playoffs. So there's a chance that Thomas, hopefully, if he gets some sort of closure after his sister's funeral, which is we hope that for him, and he can get his mind back focused on basketball, if that's what's necessary for him, he's got a good chance to exceed that sort of value. At $9,000 on FanDuel, I'm not quite as into it, but it's still pretty good value, and I think that he should be a guy that you really are looking at in cash and in tournaments as well. Now, on the other side, Johnny Wall's at $10,400. In theory, you'd think that John Wall, with Isaiah Thomas guarding him, it's going to work in his favor, but that's not always what happens, because Avery Bradley will jump on, Marcus Smart will jump on him quite a bit, and yes, they've got Bradley Beal as well, but you're going to see a lot of Smart and a lot of Bradley doing the guarding on Wall. And in contrast to Thomas's performance over the last 3 games against the Wizards, Wall has struggled in the last 3 against Boston, averaging just 41 points. We know the funeral issues between these two teams, dressing in black, Marcus Smart and John Wall, cash me outside, all that sort of stuff. It's not even fake tough guy stuff. The waiting outside locker rooms, the security on the buses, all that sort of stuff. So we're going to have a physical series. But Wall has struggled a little bit with just a 41-point average in 37 minutes against the Celtics in their last 3 regular season matchups. Wall was crushing it in Atlanta. He had, or against Atlanta, he averaged for 41 over the last 5, 48 across the last 5 of the series. At 10-4 though, depending on how my money is looking, if I've got the cash, I take Wall. If I don't, then I'm more than happy to go down to Thomas there. So because I like the way that they have played throughout the regular season, and it's not a Thomas guarding Wall situation as it might seem if you're just looking at it offhand. At 10-8 on DraftKings for Wall, that puts him very far down my list of guys that I want at point guard. I would much rather take Isaiah Thomas in that situation there. Terry Rozier is an interesting one. He had 18 points in Game 6 against the Bulls in 22 minutes, and he's priced at $2,300. His form had actually been all right since he sort of got those minutes back, but we're of no guarantee that he's going to play 18 or 19 minutes in this matchup here. 2,300 for Rozier is all right, but I would strictly leave that as a tournament sort of player. I've got Luke Smith says, any thoughts on the Isaiah Thomas carrying accusations? Yeah, he carries. Every bloody player in the NBA does it, so it doesn't bother me at all. It was a weird thing for Hoiberg to do, unprompted, bring that up. Yeah, Isaiah Thomas carries it. Everybody does. Every single player carries it at some point in the NBA, so it honestly doesn't bother me whatsoever. No issues with that. As for Rozier over on DraftKings, he's at $2,600, so the appeal is lessened there. But you could still consider him a GPP guy, but not as high an upside as the 2.3 that he is on FanDuel. Brando Jennings is at 2.6. Really, yeah, look, the minutes have been okay for Jennings, averaging 15 minutes in the last 3. 5 points though, it's not cutting it, and I don't really feel great for him, but he's always that guy that can pop off and have this weird big performance. But I reckon we're going to see 40 minutes of John, we're going to see 40 minutes of Braddles Beal, and it's going to leave Jennings' minutes really, really low, and it is going to be a struggle for him. So I would rather take a guy like Rozier if I'm taking a punt on someone in a tournament. For the shooting guards, well, Gerald Green, it all depends on what happens with him. He did have 21 points in that Game 6 against the Bulls. He's at 2,100. Because I don't know exactly what they're going to do. Now, if we hear the information that Green is starting, I would actually feel not too bad about looking at him as a cash play at 2,100. I don't think that's a bad option. But there is that risk that they don't start him, or they play him 2 6-minute halves, which they did in Game 5. And that really limits what he can do. But He's played well in the last 4 games. And at 2,100, you feel he's a really decent chance, a really good chance, in fact, of getting value. So I don't hate it as cash, and I do think that he actually has some tournament upside. He almost got to 9x in Game 6 against the Bulls. Obviously, he played more minutes due to that blowout of that game. As for Bradley Beal, 7,900. He's been crushing Atlanta. He's been playing fantastically. I've got no concerns with Beal getting 40, so I think he is a pretty rock-solid guy and almost someone I consider a core player on FanDuel and DraftKings, while Avery Bradley at 6'4", started to get it going in the last couple of games. 33.5 in Game 6, which is obviously an increase in production for what he'd been doing. At 6'4", he is okay. I don't hate it for cash. I think he's got a decent floor, to be honest. I just don't know how high his upside is. And as for Marcus Smart at 6,000, that just feels too high, and I'm not really interested there. But Marcus Smart on DraftKings, 5,200. I reckon that's rock solid. I think you're getting 23, 24 out of Smart almost no matter what. Now, for 6,000 on FanDuel, I don't think you're getting 30 out of him, but I think you're getting 24, 25. So at 5,200, that is really good value for Smart. So it shows that difference of $800, how much of a difference it actually can make. And I think we're going to see a lot of Smart to come in match up on Wall and Beal. If Thomas runs into trouble, and they could potentially hide, I know Otto Porter's a lot bigger than Thomas, but they just don't give the ball to Porter at all. So that might be something that they do decide to do and give Smart 30, 34, 35 minutes even, and that might limit Rozier also. So that's another way to look at it. But I think we're going to see a fair bit of Smart. And at 5,200, I actually think that's a pretty good situation for him. At small forward, Otto Porter, as I said, they don't give him the ball enough, but I like the fact that he's at 4,900, and that's a salary that you can use him at 55 on DraftKings for Porter. I'm not quite there with him, but it's definitely not a terrible play. But at 4,900, I feel pretty good about him in cash, giving me 5x worth of value, and I think that's a very, very good price for Otto Porter. As for Jay Crowder, 6,200, as Brad Smith asked, what's my thoughts on Crowder? It's too high. You can take Otto Porter at $1,300 less, who probably going to score about the same amount of points, if not more. I cannot, unless I'm just going, hey, let's go contrarian and take Crowder in a tournament. I want nothing to do with him at that sort of a price tag. It's just too high for me. He's at 56 on DraftKings, Crowder, so that's a little bit better, and he has done well against Washington. I give him that, so I look to him a little bit more on DraftKings, but it's still leaning more towards being a tournament play. But at that sort of a price, it is a little bit more interesting for Jay there. Oubre and Bogdanovic, 3,000 for Oubre, 4,000 for Bogdanovic. I'm taking one of them. I'm taking Oubre just because it's $1,000 less, and I can get a little bit more return on my investment, enabling me to put in DeAndre or Chris Paul or go up to John Wall from another lesser point guard if I've got that cash around. At power forward, there's not a lot happening here. Markieff Morris, finally, he had a good game 1, he had a good game 6, and he had 4 stinkers in the middle. He had 35 in game 6. He played 40 minutes. He stayed out of foul trouble, and he's at 5,900. He has struggled a little bit against Boston, but not to a huge degree. But they've bumped his salary up by $600 now on FanDuel, so that makes Markieff a not great option. But when we look at the entirety of this slate, the power forwards are terrible. Obviously, Blake Griffin is out for the Clippers. Derek Favors is not playing for Utah, so it's Boris Diaw. Do you go with Mo Spates? Like, if you're looking for any sort of consistent power forward option, there's none. So Markieff, despite me saying that this is not a good price, it might be the best power forward that you just have to have in. And him on DraftKings at 5,300, I think you almost have to have him at 5,300 because the flakiness of the other options means that in cash, it's going to be real hard to go past Markieff. And Markieff's not the solidest cash guy either, but the other options are just not good. So that is something to pay some attention to. Now, you can take an Otto Porter at power forward on DraftKings, so maybe that changes it, but I really do think that given the other options at that spot, that Markieff's going to come into a lot of lineups. Jonas Jerebko's at 1,600. He had 16 points in the last game. We've seen it. Playoffs last year, playoffs this year, that Jerebko starts getting more minutes. He had 16 points, in Game 6. He was in the perfect DFS lineup from Game 5. At 1,600, he doesn't need to do anything to actually be a useful option. It's all does Amir Johnson come back. And if we see Amir Johnson back in the starting lineup, I want nothing to do with that Jerebko. But if Johnson's out, Green starting, then Jerebko at 1,600, yeah, sure. And I even don't hate it for cash because at 1,600, as I said, what does he actually need to do to get to value? 8 points? And if he gets 12, 13 minutes, I think Jerebko can do that. So he is someone at that price, if you're going big in other areas, that can really work out. With Yeonmi Hinmi out, Jason Smith at 3,300, maybe, but it'd more be just a tournament type of look for Smitty. Now, as for Jerebko, he's at 2,200 on DraftKings, so that does take a little bit of his upside away as being a cash play, and I might consider him a tournament guy, but I probably wouldn't. As for Marcin Gortat, no Mahinmi, so that's a tick, but he played just 18 minutes in Game 6. He'd been playing big minutes. Prior to that, he hadn't been good, but he'd been playing big minutes. He's at $6,000. I have a marginal level of interest in him, but I would rather go cheaper with a Gerald Green, say at shooting guard potentially, and push my center up to a DeAndre Jordan, maybe not a Rudy Gobert given his ankle problem, but I don't feel overly confident with Gortat, but it could be a situation like Morris where you go, well, I'm not really sure about these other centers and how the price fits in, but he wouldn't be a core guy to look at. Al Horford, I feel okay about, but that price is pretty steep, 8,300. It's better on DraftKings at 7,500, and I think that's worth looking at. It's worth looking at on both sides, and he was great in the series against Chicago. Big Al. He's also done well against Washington in the regular season, so 8,300 is all right, but I do really like 7,500 for Big Al Horford. Kelly Olynyk is always one to pay some attention to. He's at $5,000, but I just don't feel like he's going to get enough minutes, unfortunately, to have that sort of sustained impact. He's at 42 on DraftKings, Olynyk. Still, I've been looking at him more as a 38 sort of guy rather than a 4,000, 4,500 guy. Let's move on to the Game 7 between the Utah Jazz and the Los Angeles Clippers. The Clippers are favored by 3.5, and the total is 190.5, and that's a big drop in terms of what the total was from the first game, which was 215 points. So we're talking a 25-point drop in the total. So you're going to get most likely more possessions, more fantasy scoring from that Washington-Boston game. Now, before we move on to it, Brad Smith thinks, do I think Bradley guards Wall or Beal? I think they're going to split time, but if I had to say one guy, I think that Bradley guards Beal more, and I think you see more Smart on Wall. But I think, starting out the game with Smart on the bench, I think you'll see Bradley on Wall, then he'll make the switch when they do the subs and get Green out for Smart, and then you'll see Bradley move on to Beal that way. But it'll vary quite a bit, I believe. But that's how I initially see it. All right, let's talk point guards, and we have to start with Chris Paul, of course, who's at 10,400, and he's kept the Clippers in this series with the absence of Blake Griffin. If I'm spending 10,000 on a point guard, it's going to be Paul over Wall, I believe, despite the fact that this is a slower pace series. I just think that Paul's going to have a monster to get them over the line. He's averaging over 50 the last 3 games. He's at 10-2 DraftKings, 10-4 FanDuel. Like him much better on DraftKings, especially with the $600 saving you get on him over Wall, and they're the same price on FanDuel. So Chris Paul would be the guy that I do take over John, despite the slower pace in this game. Now, Georgie Hill is one of those mid-priced point guards. He's at 6,000, so I would rather take him on FanDuel, say, over Marcus Smart, who's a $6,000 player as well. He had 35 in Game 6. Georgie Hill, I think he's going to have another big one here. So that's a nice way if you don't want to be spending up for 2 big point guards. Hill becomes that option that is a relatively solid guy to put in at that sort of a salary. He's at 6 on DraftKings as well. Raul Neto got the backup minutes in the last game. He's at 1,500. That doesn't really matter because he doesn't do anything. He had 5 points in the last game. He's not really going to put up big numbers, so I'm not too concerned about him. But I'll tell you who I love, and you know I love it. It's Austin Rivers, 3,300. He was a great pick in the last one. He played 35 minutes, expected again. He scored 20 points, and now he's at 3,300. So it is a big jump in his salary, a $1,200 rise, but I don't care. I think that Rivers can get 20, and I think he can actually go higher. Now, Austin comes in at 4,000 over on DraftKings, so it's not quite as good a salary situation, but I still think that there's value in Austin Rivers. So pairing up a high-priced point guard, whether that's Thomas, Paul, or Wall, with Rivers is a good way of going, and then maybe you can get your Brad Beal and you can get your DeAndre Jordan in. That's with FanDuel, obviously, with the 2 point guards. But given that all of the high price guys aside from Gobert are playing point guard, then it might you can look at Rivers and go, look, he's got this great value, great ratio, all that sort of stuff. But if it means putting him in there and then having to spend money in other positions that don't necessarily equate the same value, it's not going to be as good a ploy. So while I do like Rivers a lot on FanDuel, if it means that you're spending up and you're banking your lineup on, here's my $6,000 of Marcin Gortat, and value in other areas which maybe isn't quite there, then maybe it's not the best way to go. But it is something that you do have to investigate, especially at that sort of a salary that Austin currently sits at. I don't think there's much to see with Ray Felton. At shooting guard, JJ Redick's at 3,900. He had 5 points in the last game, so a real disappointment after a big 30-pointer the game before. Really hard to rely upon him in a cash setting, but in tournaments you do like that upside. Same with Jamal Crawford at 3,100, who's averaging 18 over the last three. 18, 3,000, that's 6x value, and that's pretty good. I'm not looking at him for cash, though, because he is quite streaky in what he produces. Rocket Rodney Hood at 4,000. I would take Crawford. I would take Redick over Hood any day, especially considering both of those guys are cheaper. At small forward, Gordo Hayward's at 8,500. That's not a bad way to spend $8,000. I think that he is a solid option. He's at 85 on both sides. Dropped to 50 with DraftKings scoring in Game 6, and he's going to have to do a lot to keep the Jazz in this one. So I'm all aboard Gordon Hayward. Marmute is not shutting him down as much now. Marmute is playing more on Joe Johnson, and Rivers has Hayward now a lot. So that is helping Hayward put up some bigger numbers. So I've got no problem with utilising him at that sort of a salary. Jinglin Joe at 4,900 with Hayward playing so much and Hood getting some more minutes. I don't think that the value really is there for Ingles at that price. And Luke Marmute at 4,300, much like Robertson in the Rockets Oklahoma City series, we can look at him and go, they've got no offense, but he's continually churning out numbers. He had 24 in Game 6. He's averaging 21 across the last 5 games. And at 4,300, if I'm going to get 20 points out of someone at 4,000, I'm okay with that. Now, it's not the best way to go about it, but you know that he's going to get minutes. We know that Marmute is going to get minutes, and if they leave him open, he can get some scoring, which has happened for him in this series. Then there's a chance that he gets to 20, and it's a fairly good chance as opposed to some of the other guys that might be sitting at that price point. Boris Diaw's at 3,300, Mo Spates at 4,000. I would much rather take Marmute at 4,300 than take a flyer on a Mo Spates at that similar price. I just don't think there's any chance that Spates gets to that level. So Marmute is an option. Now, Joe Johnson struggled in Game 6, just the 14 points. He's at 5,700. We know he's been great throughout the series. I think that's probably a little bit much for Joe. And that would be one of those ones that, say, if you did put Austin Rivers in at point guard and then you're spending up and you go, I'm going to spend up for Joe Johnson, I'm not sure that's the best way to spend up and spend that 5,700 worth of cash there on him. As for Paul Pierce, he played 22 minutes. What? He played 22 minutes in Game 6 and had 7 points. I don't care how many minutes he's getting. There's no value, really, in Paulie Pierce. For the power forwards, Mo Spates, Derek Favors. Spates, forget it. Rivers is back. He's not playing. He's going to be backup center. That's it. Derek Favors, also a backup center. And at 5,800 for a guy that's playing 14 minutes, unless Gobert goes down again, there's absolutely nothing to see with either of those players. Now the centers. We've got DeAndre Jordan at 7,200. Since Gobert's come back, his production has fallen off. He averaged 29 in the last 3 games with Gobert back. But thankfully, the salary's come down by $600. So he's at $7,200 now. And that gives you a little bit of breathing space. 74 for him over on DraftKings as well. I think that's a really good spot to use him. Even if he doesn't get you 35, if he gets you 30, which is what he's been doing, I don't think that's a bad result at 7,200. Now, as for Gobert, 9,600, he is going to play with this ankle problem, but it doesn't mean he's going to be at full effectiveness. And 9,600 is a lot. There is no way that I would spend that. I would take DeAndre, save the $2,500, and go and invest it in Gordon. Yeah, play up to Gordon, play up to Chris Paul at point guard. I think that's a better way to do it rather than spending the 96 on Gobert. Now, Gobert's at 78 on DraftKings, so it's a big difference. Jordan's at 74, so it becomes a bit more toss-uppy there. And in fact, on DraftKings, I probably would rather Gobert over DeAndre. I still just have that little bit of concern about his ankle, but at 7,800, he definitely comes into play, whereas on FanDuel, I reckon he's pretty much out of consideration. All right, as I said, today was going to be a short show. That's the preview of the 2 games. Tomorrow, we'll be back to review these two games and then preview the other two games in round 2, Cavs, Raps, and whatever the other one is that I can't remember off the top of my head. Spurs, Rockets. That's the other one. We'll be back to preview those tomorrow. Good luck if your team is the Jazz. Good luck if your team is the Clippers. Good luck if your team is the Wizards. And good luck if your team is the Celtics. We're getting down to the business end of the season now. Obviously, keep listening to the podcast. We're doing all this DFS stuff, and then we're going to transition into season review podcasts at some point in May, and we will be doing the 2016 redraft in the coming week or two. Probably not this week, as I said, probably the week after when the games thin out a little bit. We'll shove one of those pods in there somewhere. If you do like the podcast, support it by going and subscribing on YouTube, on iTunes, on Google Play, on Stitcher and TuneIn, and leave a review. Even if you're not going to listen to the show, just download it. Grab your friend's phone, download it onto there as well. Help those numbers come out and support our sponsors. You've got ziprecruiter.com/LOFB, blueapron.com/LOFB. We have SeatGeek and the promo code LOFantasy there as well, and dollarshaveclub.com/LOFB. Support the podcast, get yourself some great deals there as well. We are done here, guys. Thank you so much for listening, everyone. See ya.